Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Susan Tai, Elizabeth Atkins Curator of Asian Art at this museum, and I see many familiar faces here for the lecture, and thank you very much for coming on such a, beautiful day. That's always difficult sometimes. But this is the third of the 3 lectures we have planned for the exhibition, single lectures for the exhibition pretty much this year. But I hope you will come back in January, because on January 6th, we're going to have a one-day public lecture series still, and this time broadening the subject of the bird and flower, or flower and bird paintings into a larger context. And I'll just read the title of this lecture series to you, and hopefully to tempt you to come. We will have 7 scholars here. But anyway, the title is Contemplating Nature, Flowers, Gardens, and Self-Reflection in Chinese Painting. And expert art historians will offer detailed glimpses into some of the many facets of the flower and bird genre in Chinese painting, and reveal how these intimate objects or intimate images of nature, the images of intimate nature can be thresholds to worlds rich with beauty and private emotions. And we certainly will get a little bit of that in today's lecture as well. And we thank you, and also thank our sponsors, Friends of Asian Art, as well as some of the donors who are among you to this particular exhibition. And I do want to especially thank our museum's Women's Board, who's the lead sponsor in helping with or supporting this exhibition. And the reason I especially mention Women's Board is today's speaker, Peter Sturman's mother, is a member of the Women's Board. And we know this board has been the oldest museum support group. And the group of women have always been, every year, work tirelessly to try to get support for the museum, and they certainly have sponsored many of the important exhibitions in this museum, including this one. So you're representing Women's Board. I'm sure there are a few other Women's Board members here as well, so we thank you. Now, today's speaker, Peter Sturman, is not a stranger to the museum. As you saw, many people was talking to him, and very glad to see him. And he has given quite a few lectures here over the years. And in fact, I often feel like he's part of my colleague here, because he's the one I run to very often whenever it comes to art on Chinese art, as well, especially Chinese paintings. And as I mentioned before, during the time his wife, Huishu Li, who teaches at UCLA, was giving a lecture here a few weeks back, that 2 of them have been the resident experts in Chinese paintings in Santa Barbara. And over the years, not only he has given lectures, he has conducted significant lecture series or symposiums for the museum as well. And most important of all was a wonderful project that he and I collaborated for this museum. It's an exhibition and publication on the subject of the title, Art for Recluse, Poetry, Painting, and Politics in 17th Century Chinese Painting. And that exhibition and the publication are probably one of the most significant projects that this museum has ever conducted, and certainly in the area of Asian art. And we're very proud to say that the publication Peter was in charge of for that exhibition won a national award. That's an award that's given by the College Arts Association, which is our professional organization, that year, and as the best catalog of exhibition catalog of the year in 2012 to 2013. And that is certainly the first award that this museum has gotten from, we call CAA, College Arts Association, that we're very proud to have. So thanks to Peter. And that's, even though sometimes he artfully would term that the award was really awarding his museum scholarship. Okay, then, let me tell you, Peter, did I touch something? I need a crab back. No. Oh, I'm sorry, I've been touching. Sorry, Professor. Peter Sturman has gotten his MA from Stanford University and MA and PhD from Yale University. And his specialization is Chinese painting and calligraphy. He's actually internationally known as the scholar of Chinese calligraphy, based on quite a few publications on the subject. And he covers the area at the time, really early to modern Chinese history, and especially the intersections of text, theories, and images. And his primary focus is on literati culture of the Northern Song dynasty, 11th, 12th century, and its immediate aftermath. And through the late, and the court that covers the 11th century court art of late Northern Song, Loyalist art of Song and Yuan, transition, and most recently, of course, painting and calligraphy of the 17th century. And he's the author, as I mentioned, of several fairly significant publications on Chinese painting and calligraphy, covering a wide range of areas, including the catalog he did for us. So without further ado, please help me welcome Peter Sturman.
Thank you, Susan. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay. And I echo Susan's appreciation for everybody coming on such a gorgeous day, just typical in Santa Barbara, but nonetheless, it's always nice to be outside when it's sunny. And Susan referred to me as a colleague, and I want to echo that as well. I came here in 1988. It's my first job, really, my first important job, I should say, and been here ever since, of course. And Susan was one of the very first people I met, and she's took me under her wing and always included me with various events and things happening at the museum, visiting collections around California, and she's just been a wonderful supporter and colleague all these years. So anyway. Sketching ideas, writings, visuality, and Chinese flower and bird painting. Maybe about 2-3 weeks ago, I was visiting the collection, the exhibition, and I ran into a woman up there who was one of the docents, and we talked for a little while. I'm afraid she's not here today because she told me she had to go visit her first great-grandchild, which was a very good excuse. But she shared with me that she particularly liked this painting. And I can see why. It's a gorgeous painting. And typical of its kind in terms of what it represents about flower and bird painting, being something that captures an image that's very attractive in a very attractive way. So I thought I would share this because this is exactly what I'm not going to be talking about for a minute. But as I looked at this painting and I read its inscription, one of the first things I noticed is that it's painted by this artist named Tang Yu Zhao. Not that old by Chinese standards, but old enough, of course, 18th century, I think, 17th, 18th century. He was from Piling, which is the part of the region in the Jiangnan, a city in the Jiangnan region, or south of the Yangtze River, that was famous for some reason for this kind of painting. And here's another example of something called the Piling School. Something maybe 400 years even earlier. And then I looked at the inscription and it said, part of a poem reads, "What need for the orchid's fragrance to grow close? This gentleman among flowers has the flavor of truth." I also looked at the technique of the painting, which is something we call the boneless method, where you don't use ink outlines, but rather just pure color for the most part. I mean, there is some ink in the painting. And I was thinking, you know, this exhibition, even though the paintings are, again, by Chinese standards, relatively late, Ming and Qing dynasties, nonetheless, it's just remarkable how much they reflect such a long tradition. So you have this painting school from a particular region of China that goes back to the Song dynasty, called the Piling School, that specialized in waterfowl and lotuses and beautiful hanging scrolls. And then you have an inscription like this, which references the orchid and comparing it to the lotus. And anybody who is involved with Chinese literature would know very quickly, would recognize, you know, this tremendously long history of associations and allusions that every flower and every bird and just about everything in China has in making reference to human qualities or individuals or oneself. And then this last line, "This gentleman among flowers has the flavor of truth," which I'll talk a little bit more about today in my lecture, but this idea that truth and authenticity and the aesthetic qualities that are associated with it, you know, it just opens up so many doors and so many avenues. But as I said, what I want to talk about is a very different kind of painting. There are a few of them in the collection, basically monochromatic for the most part. There's a little bit of color in this bird up on the top by Li Shan. This other painting on the left is a very well-known painter. And this is one of the great paintings in the exhibition by an artist named Zheng Xie or Zheng Banqiao, early 18th century. They're both 18th century artists, known as two of the eccentrics of the Yangzhou school. They represent here this kind of sketchy way of painting with a heavy reliance on the brush, and particularly in the case of Zheng Banqiao's painting, where you can see in the detail here, some of the calligraphy, how much writing plays a role in this. So partly it's in the brushwork, but also the integration of text into the painting. And of course, the best exemplar of this kind of painting and the real reason to see this exhibition, even if nothing else was here, if they just brought this one painting, it would well be worth the price of admission. In fact, everybody from the United States who's interested in Chinese art should be flying to Santa Barbara just to see this painting. It's that important. Bada Shanren's Flowers on a River. This is just a detail of this very, very long scroll. So this is an excellent example of this kind of painting that we refer to as, in Chinese, as Xieyi. Here's the term, the way we write it in romanization in English, or with the Roman alphabet, Xieyi. But literally means the writing of concepts or the writing of ideas. Writing. To write calligraphy, to write one's ideas. And this is another fantastic example of this kind of painting. A couple of photos I took myself from it's just these two little paintings that are connected, probably originally perhaps part of a longer scroll, because this particular artist named Xieyi often did these kinds of paintings that usually flowers, but sometimes animals and birds, and actually quite a variety of different things, in a particularly free and exuberant and quite modern, really, manner of painting. So I'm going to talk about Xieyi. I'm not going to talk so much about Badashanren, because for one reason being that my wife, Professor Huishu Li, was here and gave a lecture on that really focused on that, and I did want to duplicate what she said. But also you have the catalog, and you have access to the essay that she wrote. And Badashanren's a very complicated subject. But I did want to talk about Xieyi because that's an artist that I've been working on over the last few years, and tie him into this longer tradition of what we call Xieyi, sketching of ideas. And to do that, I'm going to go back further in time to the 11th century. So in this way, I will be kind of picking up where the last speaker, David Sensabaugh, an old friend of mine, kind of left off. He talked about the early tradition, and I will pick it up where more or less in the 11th, 12th century, but very quickly move from this early period where what we call literati painting begins, and the importance of calligraphy and the expression of ideas finds its way into painting, and then carry it forward, jumping rather suddenly into the 16th century with this artist Xieyi, who's a very interesting character. I think you'll all agree, and I guarantee you won't be bored by some of his stories. I'm showing you here a portrait. This is a detail from a very famous and very long hand scroll by later ode on the Red Cliff by an artist who's not particularly well known, but it's one of the very rare 12th century paintings that we have that we call literati painting. And you can see this painting as well is monochromatic. So you can already sense from the lack of color what this kind of painting is all about. But the figure that's portrayed here is the actual author of this poem. So it's an illustration of this ode on the Red Cliff. It's very famous in Chinese literature, written by this figure named Su Shi. And Su Shi is one of the most famous people in the whole cultural history of China. He's very well known as a statesman, as a politician, as a thinker, not really as a religious figure, though he dabbled in just about everything. And today we also think of him as particularly important as a poet, a writer of all kinds of writings, but also as a calligrapher and even as a painter. So he was truly a kind of a Renaissance person who lived in the 11th century and was extremely important. In fact, we largely attribute the formation, the construction, the incipience of what we call literati painting, this particularly important tradition in Chinese painting, to what Su Shi wrote, and particularly what he wrote about his cousin and friend, a person by the name of Wen Tong, and I'll show you his paintings in a second. But I first wanted to show you a piece of calligraphy because, to a large degree, what Su Shi did in turning painting into this very kind of expressive art, an art form that we call the painting. We call it literati painting because it's the painting of scholar officials. These are the intelligentsia of China. They're not professional painters, so we're not talking about the people who painted temples and provided services to the court and things like that, but rather the so-called kind of gentleman painters. These are people more or less like everybody in the audience here and myself, people who have an education and do not think of themselves as professional painters, but dabbled in painting as a potential means of expressing their ideas and their concepts. So to do that and to differentiate themselves from the professional painters, they turned to calligraphy. And I'm showing you here an example of a much later piece of calligraphy, but it's a particularly nice example by an artist also very well known in the tradition by the name of Dongqi Chang. And you can see the movements of the brush. I think everybody here is a little bit familiar, at least, with what we mean by calligraphy, the writing of Chinese characters with a brush. Now here's an example of Sucher's own writing. So, I mean, on the one hand, you can immediately see through the use of the brush the shared characteristics with this kind of painting, this monochromatic painting, that also relies on the brush and perhaps some ink wash, but is largely eschewing the use of colors and things like that. But there's much more involved, and a lot of it has to do with what calligraphy offers. Calligraphy is, why is calligraphy considered an art form? I mean, that's fundamentally, it's not just the beautiful writing of the Chinese characters with the brush, but it's the fact that the nature of the Chinese characters is such, in the writing of them, that we can follow the traces of the brush stroke by stroke. And there's tremendous variation in the possibilities of writing. Just like in the West, we have this idea of graphology, where you can look at somebody's writing and perhaps tell somebody's character from that. That's a much more developed art form in China because there's so much more involved with the writing of the use of the Chinese calligraphic brush. So from very early on, the writing of calligraphy was considered to be an art of expression. So that's very different from from painting, for example, in which you're painting something that you see. To paint what one feels wasn't really much of a concept in early China. Not until you got people like Sucher involved with painting, or at least interested in painting. And so there were multiple reasons for this kind of melding of the two, writing, calligraphy, and painting. Fundamentally, in fact, it was even suggested before Sucher. That's often forgotten because Sucher is such an important figure in this. But there was a man by the name of Zhang Yenyuan. You can see his name right here, Zhang Yenyuan. And who wrote a very important text called Record of Famous Painters and Paintings Through the Dynasties. You can see how early this is, 847. Basically the Middle Ages in the West, right? And in this text, he had to write an apology for painting, because painting at this particular time, which was the late Tang Dynasty, was for the most part not considered to be something that gentlemen did, or people of letters, or people who had important positions in the government or whatever. Though there were some who dabbled in painting, nonetheless, he felt obliged to make an excuse for why painting is important. He says, now painting is a thing which perfects the civilizing teachings of the sages and helps to maintain the social relationships. So he gives a good Confucian rationale. It penetrates completely the divine permutations of nature and fathoms recondite and subtle things. Its merit is equal to that of any of the 6 arts of antiquity, and it moves side by side with the 4 seasons. So that's a big summary statement about how painting is something really important, which fundamentally wasn't recognized in the 9th century. And then he says, hence we may know that through writing and painting, though writing and painting have different names, they are yet of the same substance. And what he's referring to, there's 3 dots here, is a long narration about how if you go back early enough in Chinese history, and this is very true, the earliest forms of writing, and I have a couple examples here, oracle bone writing over here on the right, and a rubbing taken from the interior of a Chinese ritual bronze here in the center, called pictorial writing. Fundamentally, the characters were, the earliest of Chinese characters were supposedly drawn from nature. They're pictorial in nature. And of course, it took, over many, many generations and centuries, the Chinese characters kind of lost their pictorial quality. They didn't entirely lose it. They are pictorial in some aspect, but they don't look like, literally like eyes or whatever this animal might be anymore, or something like this. So they've transformed over time. But you can see how Zhang Yenyuan felt compelled to do this, and it provided a very good, you could say the origins of both writing and and painting come from the same place. And in his own time, again, Zhang Yangyuan in the Tang Dynasty in the 8th, 9th century, certainly there was another reason, which is that the use of the brush had become so prominent in painting of this period. So these are a couple of details from 8th century tombs. Here's this is where this detail comes from, I think, this center image of women in a garden setting. The famous painters of the 8th and 9th century were all well known for their handling of the brush. And these are some brush strokes from a text attributed to a woman of the 3rd century by the name of Madame Wei, the so-called 7 strokes. And these are just, you can take a look at some of these strokes. I was particularly taken by the writing nature of the branches on these trees, at how similar you do have these kinds of techniques, the potential for Chinese calligraphic techniques to kind of find their way into Chinese paintings. The thing is, when Zhang Yangyuan was writing in the 9th century, things were already changing quite a bit. The use of ink wash in particular was allowing the painters to create much more realistic scenes. And even though the use of the line remained very important, there were other aspects, including the use of ink wash and shading and color used very subtly to allow the painters to create extremely realistic renditions of nature. And this is one of my favorite examples of that. It's a very mysterious painting. In fact, the last lecturer showed this painting as well. I think my slides are a little bit better. Associated with an artist by the name of Xieyi, called Wintry Bamboo. And the amazing thing about this painting, which David neglected to explain, is that even though there's a lot of ink in the painting, the ink is used for the most part in a negative way. So in other words, the artist left these bamboo strokes unpainted, with the exception of some interior lines. And he painted the background. So it's like painting in reverse, where you're painting everything and you're leaving the bamboo, the substance of the painting is basically left to a large degree to be just the unpainted part of the silk. So this is such an amazing painting, and it's also an amazing image. And I've been showing it in my class and talking about it. And the thing that strikes me is not only is it kind of an experimental way of painting, it's what it implies. It implies the importance of capturing the environment. It's kind of making the painting appear, making nature, and particularly this beautiful rendering of the bamboo, in such a way that you get this sense that you're walking into this wild piece of nature and encountering in this wintry landscape this kind of detail of the bamboo. It's really an amazing painting. A lot of people kind of consider it almost a kind of a one-trick pony because you don't see this kind of thing done anymore. And I can imagine it must have been extraordinarily difficult to paint something like this. And you have to think the whole thing out, and you're painting everything except for the leaves of the bamboo, or the substance of the bamboo. Anyway, it's quite an extraordinary painting. But there's another reason why it's a very important painting in the context of what I want to talk about, and that is because of the tradition that Xieyi represented. And there's two traditions, and David did talk about these for those of you who were at the last lecture. Huangquan, this is not a painting by Huangquan. This is actually by the Emperor Sun Huizong, but it's in that tradition. And Huangquan, who lived about 100 years before Huizong in the 10th century, into maybe right around the year 1000. I forget his exact dates. But he was associated with the painting of kind of palace nature as it was understood from the palace. In other words, the luxuries of animals and birds that you would see in the gardens that were kind of cultivated, with beautiful birds and animals. And here's a wonderful example of that. We call this the Donald Trump bird. There's a pheasant that actually looks like this. It's pretty amazing with its blonde hair kind of combed back. But it's very, very exotic. And it's in total distinction to what Xieyi represented. And we know basically nothing about this person. But Xieyi was associated by people in the 11th century with the scholar tradition. So it's not that the scholars or the scholar officials, who were the people who basically serviced the empire as the bureaucrats and the people who took care of things, the managers of the country, of the nation. It's not that they were it's not that they were adverse to the court. They worked with the court. But you have these two traditions, the aristocracy, and then you have the scholar officials. And the scholar officials, some of whom belonged to the aristocracy, were always susceptible to the changing of policy and problems and the whims of an emperor, or the susceptible to the jealousy of other court officials or other scholar officials. So these people were often, sometimes they were in favor, sometimes they were out of favor. And naturally, scholar officials always thought of themselves as suffering under these kinds of circumstances. So the difference is that when you suffer, you're thrown out into the wilderness. So Xieyi painted these images of nature. Apparently, we don't actually have any genuine works by Xieyi. We have this one painting associated with him. But he's associated with painting basically like if you go up into the hills, or if you go off into the hinterlands, basically a metaphor for being out of favor with the court. So that brings us to Susher's friend and cousin, Wentong, who's really can be considered the beginnings of this tradition. Wentong, you can see his dates, 1018 to 1079. He was the older cousin and a mentor of Susher, and he was extremely accomplished. He passed the exams at the highest level, but he never was rewarded with high official positions. And a lot of that has to do with politics of the day, but I'm not going to get into. Instead, he spent much of his official career out in the provincial positions of today's Sichuan province, which was also where he was from. And if you go to Sichuan, you'll see lots of bamboo. He was admired for his painting, which ultimately proved problematic. Just like Zhang Yenyuan, a couple hundred years earlier, had felt compelled to write an apology for painting. You didn't want to be associated with painting. If you were a scholar official, you wanted to be known for your public policies, for your importance, for your thinking, maybe for your talents as a poet or as a calligrapher, but not as a painter. And it's only at this time that this begins to change. So he was very sensitive to that. And another important aspect of him is he was attracted to the writings and thought of the ancient Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi. And this is rather complicated, but Zhuangzi, you can see the dates, ancient times, ancient Taoist thinker, focused on things like selflessness and spontaneity. Too complicated to get into. I would use up all my remaining time just to try to give you a couple stories from Zhuangzi, but a wonderful writer, and this idea of selflessness, it's a little bit like the idea of Buddhist enlightenment, losing of oneself, kind of what we call, what do we call it nowadays, this mindfulness, where you're not locked up in your thoughts, but you're kind of aware of everything going on around you, and spontaneity. And so he associated very much with bamboo. Bamboo being the so-called gentleman of the natural world. This beautiful plant that makes this wonderful sound when the wind blows through it, and is very strong, yet it has an empty center. And there's all kinds of metaphors that go along with bamboo, but it's considered to be, in the Chinese tradition, to be this kind of metaphor of the gentleman. So he painted bamboo, and he particularly was well known for painting bamboo like this, that went dip down and then back up again, to suggest the idea of being constrained by one's circumstances, but then being able to overcome them and not be completely put down by circumstances. Okay. So these are a couple of the things that Su Shi said about Wentong. And I can't emphasize enough, these are the things that serve as the basis for much of what becomes literati painting theory. So that's how important these comments were. So he says, when Wentong painted bamboo, he saw bamboo but not himself. Nor was he simply unconscious of himself. Trance-like he left his body was transformed into bamboo, creating inexhaustible freshness. Zhuangzi is no longer in this world, so who can understand such concentration? So there's this idea of the artist literally becoming one with the subject. The prose of Wentong, Wenyuke is also his name, the prose of Wenyuke is the dregs of his virtue, and his poetry is the hair's tip of his prose. But what his poetry does not exhaust overflows into his calligraphy. His calligraphy transforms and becomes his painting. Both are the remnants of his poetry. Those who appreciate his poetry and prose are already few. Are there any who appreciate his virtue as they do his painting? What a shame. This is a good example of how smart Su Shi was. So basically what he's saying is, what's important is who you are as a person, your virtue. And next in line, in terms of the way you express your virtue, is your prose, because your prose is what you write history with, or you write policy papers, or you write admonitions to the court. But after that, what your prose then use up, then you have your poetry. Your poetry is then what's left over. That's obviously something easy to associate. But then it goes now from literature to the graphic art world. It says poetry does not exhaust, overflows into his calligraphy. And then his calligraphy transforms and becomes his painting. So these things all come out of his poetry. And then he goes on to say, what a shame that people do not appreciate who he was as a person as they do his painting. So this is a real problem back in the 11th century. The painter Wentong was well known. I mean, he was an important scholar official, and yet people only knew him as a painter. Well, if you look at Wentong's painting, and this is the one example that we have by him, and you compare it to a detail here taken from Xieyi's painting, you can see the difference, right? He's painting with a brush that makes full-fledged brush strokes. He has a two-toned approach with these leaves here in paler ink that might suggest either the flip side of the leaf or possibly something behind it. But it's fundamentally different from what Xieyi we see in that wintry bamboo. And here's a detail of a painting that's not exactly contemporary, but close enough, from about 923, and not too far away from Inner Mongolia. And you can see this is actually kind of the style of the painting that he's imitating, or based his own painting on, not imitating. You can see the different tones of the bamboo leaves. Whereas the professional artist uses this kind of stylized way of painting bamboo to represent this is bamboo. Wentong, on the other hand, is making out of this kind of erupting kind of flow, channeling of this internalized bamboo, which is how Su Shi described it, almost like throwing up and literally coming out of him and then becoming this beautiful painting. So that the idea that what you see in the painting is calligraphic. It's part of this process. And that process goes back to who Wentong is as a person. I'm going to leave Su Shi and Wentong, but just this one last very famous comment. The bamboos that grew on the cliffs to the north of Wentong's home, prefect of Lingyang being Wentong, were forked bamboos. One, when it had not yet shed its sheath, was harmed by tree grubs, and the other was imprisoned in a steep gully, hence their strange shapes. I am having this sketch engraved in stone so that art lovers will be moved and startled by this extraordinary sight, and moreover will see in their imagination the character of my late friend, which in bending but not yielding was just like this. So here he's stating very, very directly, when you look at this painting, or when you look at this image that I'm having engraved in stone, recognize that this is not just bamboo. You're looking at my friend. You're looking at Wentong. So this is an important kind of precedent for this idea of sketching of ideas. And I'm going to move on now to Xieyi, and is in some interesting ways connected to all of this material that dated some 550 years earlier. So these are pretty extraordinary paintings, and I hope you'll spend some time in the galleries and look at them. Xieyi is very well known in the West, but primarily as a painter. In fact, he was much more than a painter. He was a calligrapher. In fact, that's probably his most important art. He was known as a poet. He was a prose writer. He wrote plays. He was a musician. He was a martial artist of some sort. He was a man of many skills, many talents, but living in a very difficult and very different time period from the 11th century. Here's an example of a detail of a wonderful set of painting, a long scroll in what we used to call the Freer Gallery. Now it's called the National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C. And I like this because this particular detail here was used by James Cahill just when Chinese painting was being introduced to the West in 1960. 1960 seems like a long time ago. It was a long time ago. I hadn't a clue that I was going to become a Chinese art historian in 1960. But anyway, James Cahill knew what he was doing because he used this because he recognized that in some ways this bamboo image is such a wonderful way to kind of capture the essence, or what was considered the essence of Chinese painting for an American audience. And part of that was because of the spontaneity of the painting and how that would connect with what we have in the West we call the New York School, people like Jackson Pollock and Franz Kline and these other avant-garde artists, the most modern of artists and active in the New York scene and globally at that time. So anyway, here is Xieyi in a detail of that crab painting that's upstairs. And I looked at this painting and I was like kind of flabbergasted at how amazing it is he was able to capture this image of a crab, with this piece of a reed or possibly a rice stalk, and how realistic it is. By coincidence, I was just in the city of Shaoxing, which is where Xieyi was from, in August. And I was walking around, it was beastly hot. I'm walking around in the market early in the morning and I see these crabs. I thought, I had this vague inkling of Xieyi having painted crabs. So I took some photos of it, even though I didn't know this particular painting was in the exhibition. And this is the underside of the crabs for the most part, but look at this one. And this is the town where he was from. This is exactly the kind of crab. And it takes somebody who eats a lot of crab to know how to get that joint of the leg so expertly so that it looks literally so much. I mean, I've eaten enough crabs. I love crabs. I find them too difficult to eat, but I know enough so that when I saw this crab and when I saw this painting, I knew this is somebody who knows crabs. But the extraordinary, expertise and this kind of panache with which he paints this. This is, so quickly done, and there's no room for mistakes. So he's playing with the ink and his brush in such a way that he's able to capture this extraordinarily realistic image. And this one is even more amazing because of what he's trying to do. The point I want to make here is that Xieyi, when he did these paintings, he's not working from any tradition. other than the tradition of knowing how to use the brush and ink. It's not like this is how you paint crabs. There were ways to paint crabs, and he had painted many of them in his lifetime, or carp. But a carp splashing out of the water like this, it's, with the eyes here and it's just amazing. And then the water, this expressionistic way of painting the water. You don't find anything like it before, I'm sure. And it's just an amazing tribute to him as a talent, as an individualist. But the thing about Xieyi is he didn't himself consider his painting to be very important. He's largely known in China, he's known for many things, and some of them very bad, which I'll get into in a second, but among the good things, he's known as a calligrapher. And it's primarily as a calligrapher that I've studied him. In fact, I was part of this group. We're kind of resting our group for the last couple of years since the pandemic. But we would meet at Yale University and study. Everybody would study different aspects of Xieyi. And I was the person who worked on his calligraphy. So here's a detail of a section of a scroll, long scroll, in which he transcribed his own poems. And you can see he's well known for this extremely exuberant form of writing. And here's a portrait of him at the very beginning of the scroll. In fact, he's well known for this kind of what we call wild cursive script. And his calligraphy is really quite extraordinary. It's extraordinarily wild, and it just makes this incredible impression when you see it. I saw this in Nanjing in 2017, I think it was. And just the year before, I visited the Suzhou Museum, and I saw this scroll, and they couldn't hang it in the Suzhou Museum. The thing was so tall. So they had to show it to me like this. But finally, when it got to Nanjing in this major exhibition, they were able to hang it up. And it's just this wild writing, and it just overwhelms you, and it's so pictorial, and it's so, everybody loves this kind of thing who studies calligraphy, but it is extraordinarily wild. So if we go back to Su Shi, talking about Wen Tong, you remember that he listed his talents as prose, number 1, poetry, number 2, calligraphy, number 3, and painting, number 4, right? Painting was the least. Well, Xieyi himself also mentioned this kind of ranking of his talents, which meant that he was thinking of Su Shi. And for very good reason, because like Wen Tong, Xieyi himself was pretty much a failure. He never passed the examinations. That's in distinction from Wen Tong, who passed at a very high level. But he lived in a much different kind of environment and time period when it became that much harder to pass the exams. So throughout his life, Xieyi served as a kind of a secretary to others, often serving as a ghostwriter, writing prose pieces and sometimes poems, sometimes even calligraphy, in the names of other people. So anyway, Xieyi himself said, I rank my own talents as calligraphy first, poetry second, prose third, and painting fourth. Then I came across somebody else who either remembered it wrong or deliberately changed it, a man by the name of Zhou Lianggong, who lived about 50 years later. And he said his calligraphy was first, and then he put his painting second, and then prose and poetry third and fourth. And the reason was that he figured it's because he was a ghostwriter to others. In other words, a lot of his literary writings were done in the service of kind of working for somebody else, and consequently they weren't as important to him. Well, there are other aspects to Xieyi, and Yuan Hongdao, a very well-known scholar living about the same time, put it in a different way. He said, I'm going to rank his strangeness. His painting is strange, but it's not as strange as his prose. But his prose is not as strange as his calligraphy. But that can't compare to his poetry. But then if you compare him to the person himself, that's even stranger yet. But the strangest of all is his illness. And what was his illness? he suffered from mental illness. And it was, I mean, it was a torture for him. A very tiny bit of background. He was born in 1521 to a family with military status in modern-day, what's called Shaoxing today. A very interesting and lovely city. Repeated failures with the provincial exams. He was known early on as one of the 10 talents of Yue, which is the region around Shaoxing. And this figure here, Hu Zongxian, was very important to him. He was his first important sponsor. So this is the person that he first kind of served. Anyway, the Hu Zongxian got into a lot of political trouble, and Xieyi himself got into trouble because he was associated with Hu Zongxian, and moreover, he suffered from this kind of these things that he called the transformations. And it's hard to know exactly what it was. It might have been schizophrenia, it might have been bipolar. It's impossible to look back and determine. But periodically throughout his life, he suffered from this, and he was deeply paranoid. So when Hu Zongxian was thrown into jail and then died mysteriously in jail, Xieyi was deeply paranoid that he was going to be implicated. And then he became jealous of his wife. And he tried to commit suicide a number of times through gruesome means that I'm not going to go into. And then he became deeply paranoid, thinking that, jealous that his wife was cheating on him, and he murdered her. And for murdering his wife, he was thrown into jail. So part of my trip to the lovely city of Shaoxing, and I'm showing you a few of my photos, it's a beautiful city, I gotta say, is I wanted to track down where exactly Xieyi was in jail, because I'm writing this article about sight, and Xieyi's sight being, in this case, Xieyi's jail period. He was in jail from 1565 or late 1565 to 1572, 1573, thereabouts. He was in jail for about 6-7 years. Very interesting things coming out of his jail period. In fact, we have practically nothing in terms of calligraphy or painting from before then, but we begin to see things from his jail period. But I'm not really going to talk about that today. But I just wanted to share with you, I mean, Shaoxing is an amazing place, and part of the reason was there's so many famous people that came from this little city. It's not very far from the modern-day city of Hangzhou. If some of you may have been there in China, it's one of the well-known cities, not too far from Shanghai and Suzhou. But amazing, important people throughout history have come from there, including this is a little painting by Xieyi of the sage of Chinese calligraphy, Wang Xizhi, gazing at geese. And Xieyi himself was extremely familiar with the city of Shaoxing. He helped author part of the Gazetteer during his lifetime, and as I showed you, he definitely knew the flora and fauna and the fish and crabs of the region. But this work of calligraphy that I showed you, this is very interesting. A very well-known piece and beautifully written. And at the very end, he talks about how he got drunk and he did this work of calligraphy. This was done while he was in jail. In fact, it was the first year that he was in jail. Not only that, we know exactly where it was, well, not exactly, because it's from a different piece, but it was done within months of Xieyi doing another piece done in this particular building. And this is something my friends and I have discovered. This is a gazetteer map of the jail, or not the jail, but the whole the prefectural offices within Shaoxing. So I was able to track this down when I went to Shaoxing. Now there's a big movie theater right, over this area. So I mean, these are all old buildings that have disappeared. But I was, nonetheless, because Shaoxing is such a small place, it was relatively easy to kind of find where the jail was. So this is the jail within the compound, and this is this building where we know he did another work of calligraphy. Not only did Xieyi, was he in jail, but he also had to wear a cane, which is like wearing your dining room table over your neck, and which would have been impossible to write calligraphy with. And these, of course, are later photos and images that I was able to bring down from the internet. But he references here at the end of his inscription about the two Zhang brothers whom he was drinking with, helping carry the wood, support the wood as he walked back to his jail cell. So clearly when he was out of his, he could leave the jail cell. So he suffered in jail, there's no doubt about that. But because he was so famous and he had such important friends, and they had money, his life in jail actually became quite comfortable. And eventually his sentence, he thought he was going to be executed. That was capital punishment crime. And his sentence was commuted, and eventually he got out of jail. When he got out of jail, he wrote this, or he said this to a friend. "I was really fine in the pen. Now that I'm out, I am untethered. His lordship really did me no favors." Makes him sound totally nuts, right? But when you understand more about Xieyi, he was comfortable in that space, and he had made, over the period of 6 years, a kind of a little world within the jail. And it's very complicated. If you can read Chinese, and classical Chinese for that matter, you'd glean a lot more from this expression here that this quotation comes from. But this is written by Zhang Rulin, who was a young man at the time, and he said, when he got out of jail, he said this to me. And how did he survive? He could survive all these years, and not only that, all of these terrible methods of trying to commit suicide, including sticking a nail in his ear, among other things. And then when he was in jail, and this is very important, he wrote this commentary to a Taoist text, this mysterious Chinese text that dated from 2,000 years earlier, or 1,500 years earlier, and was all about alchemy and magic potions and numerology and the astrology and all kinds of things kind of mixed together. And he claimed to have been able to solve the secrets of this text. And when he was able to do that, he transformed. He claimed to have achieved a kind of a spiritual awakening. So that's a big kind of unknown. But when he got out of jail, he went to a friend, one of the friends who helped save him during his jail years, and he did this painting of Flowers and Trees of the Four Seasons. It's a very important painting in a private collection in America. And you can see some of the details of the painting. And this is one of the first paintings that we actually can date. The paintings are not, for the most part, are not dated. But it's the calligraphy at the end that I find really striking. Now, I understand I'm talking to an audience that, for the most part, doesn't recognize Chinese calligraphy or Chinese characters, for that matter. So you just have to take my word for it. The ghostly things that you see on the screen here are real. They're weird for anybody, not just the Chinese illiterate or the people who don't read Chinese. It's very strange writing, very powerful writing. And it's so strange that he did this for his patron, and his patron added his own little inscription at the very end. So here's his inscription. It's a poem. Busy with affairs, I laugh at this illusory world of bubbles and froth. Casually smearing flowers and rocks, I manage the passing seasons. Floral faces, year after year, grow old by the third month. Rocks often earn 100 pieces of gold. He's bragging about his painting. Here I just unleash my natural inclination, emptiness and form. Very Taoist and Buddhist terms. Who'd bother to ask if people see resemblances or not? So here you can see how this idea of painting ideas, sketching ideas and concepts coming from calligraphy is being bragged about, in a manner of speaking. And he did this frequently. Here's an album leaf that I gleaned from a book called Bamboo and Withered Trees from an album of various subjects, in which you can't even figure out what that is, right? Unless you might be able to make this out as a branch of something, until you have to read the poem, which I didn't write a translation of, but he basically says, the Taoist sketches bamboo and old trees, and in this, the flavor is like that of a Zen monk. Doesn't look at all like flowers or leaves, but it's just a kind of a jumbled mesh of canglao. Canglao is very hard to translate. It just means it's like a calligraphy term that means something like jumbled and old and hoary and complicated and mysterious, by which he's referring to something like this. I'm just struck by how he's able to play with this kind of materiality in which he's like self-consciously talking about the painting, and he doesn't care if it looks at all like what it's supposed to be. More importantly, it looks like something calligraphic. And he did this frequently, never more spectacularly than with this particular very celebrated scroll in the Nanjing Museum of miscellaneous flowers, in which you can recognize these flowers, but it's just such a wonderful kind of mixing of this talent for rendering things the way he knew them or saw them, but then giving them such an exuberant, abstract kind of life. So we recognize this as a pomegranate and a melon, perhaps. I'm not 100% sure for every one of these, chrysanthemums. And then when you look at some of these details, they're just like, again, it's like Jackson Pollock all over again. So you come to the very end of the scroll, and he ends with these plum blossoms, and then Narcissus. And then you come to an inscription written by a later figure, Wang Fanggang, pretty well known, of the Qing dynasty, and he wrote something like, from this painting we know that there's nothing in the world that is not cursive calligraphy. So in other words, he recognized that by looking at this painting, he's fundamentally looking at Xu Wei's wild cursive calligraphy. And Xu Wei himself ends the painting with this one single line. His signature says, Dianshi Daoren, Dianshi Shanren, Xu Wei Si Mo, which means to playfully smear. And I took this photo myself. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, he must have done this purposely. The way he wrote these last two characters and the way they're written over the final brushstrokes of his painting to create this kind of world in which text and image kind of creates its own kind of interior space. So let's look a little bit more closely at these two paintings. Translation, my translation. Cold fish stench fills the paper, blown by a flapping fin breeze. You can see how strange his poetry is. I'd never seen the character for stench. I had to look that one up. Fish stench. White scales fly forth and the ink pond is empty. I truly hate this floating world for its many unseeing eyes. Who gets that its ordinary form was once that of a dragon? He might have been talking about himself, or possibly whoever he was painting for. But the idea is that the carp, an ordinary fish, was once a dragon. But so amazing. I mean, he's thinking, viscerally about the smell of the fish and the jumping out of the water, and the water literally being called an ink pond. So he's thinking about how this fish is literally coming out of the paper. This is really pretty amazing. Oops. I thought I had my crab. What happened to my crab? Anyway, I think that must come next. Yeah, okay. I've been trying to kind of wrestle with my own ideas about Xieyi, and it's difficult because you get so many ideas, but then if you're going to be a responsible art historian, you have to try to prove things or at least make an argument that's convincing. But I was coming to grips with this idea of this transformation that he underwent when he was in jail, and this claim of having achieved this kind of sense of enlightenment and understanding, and how that would be expressed through his calligraphy. And of course, you can look at the wildness of the calligraphy. There are many aspects of the calligraphy, but one of them is when we look at calligraphy, it's the spacing of the calligraphy, of brushstrokes and the lines and the characters. And I was talking about this with a friend in Shanghai, and he says to me, I was thinking the same thing, and he shared with me this photograph of a work of calligraphy, and he said, I'd never seen calligraphy quite like this, and he pointed to this in particular. He says, where you follow, he has a thirsty brush, the brush is not filled with ink, and the way it moves around, it almost looks like a three-dimensional structure. It looks like a sculpture, because it looks like the brushstroke, the way it curls around, there's a sense of three-dimensionality to it. And this is said to me by a Chinese friend who's very familiar with calligraphy, and it's just so unusual. It's one thing to talk about the so-called the 8 sides of the Chinese character, in calligraphy, to try to give it a spatial dimension. But to be able to actually achieve that is quite extraordinary. Pinching its reed, where's it going to make offerings to the spirits of the sea? Clever little poem in which Xieyi, thinks of the crab like himself, perhaps serving a life of servitude to others, offering his writings, his painting, his calligraphy, and offering to the spirits of the sea, but having its own sense of freedom. Okay, I'm going to end by just showing you a couple of slides of Bada Shanren's work, because I did want to kind of draw it together. I'm convinced, as others also have been, that Xieyi was influential on Bada Shanren. Bada Shanren, you see his dates here, lived about 75 years later. And these are a couple of paintings by Bada Shanren. And the way that Xieyi, combines image with poem or text, and usually self-referentially, talking about himself, and with that sense of incredible compositional balance, so that the red and the black bamboo is perfectly balanced by this calligraphy, which in itself talks not just about bamboo, but talks about dragonflies and how dragonflies can transform into bamboo. Or the Mandarin fish, which is a self-referential image of himself as a leftover subject of the fallen Ming dynasty, looking up at this poem. There are all these aspects to Bada Shanren, and I've been thinking about, where they differ, and in what ways, and how his paintings differ from those of Xieyi. And I think Bada Shanren goes a step further. And the reason why he was able to go a step further is that he became an expert in landscape painting, which is something that Xieyi did a few kind of things that are kind of sketches of scenes, you could say, but he never really did landscape painting as far as I know. And partly I think that's because Xieyi was never really took himself seriously as a painter. But Bada Shanren devoted his life, his life was lost, essentially. He was a member of the fallen Ming dynasty living in the first decades of the Qing dynasty, the Manchus. His life was in danger for much of his life, became a monk, and eventually just lived as a hermit. And he did paint landscapes, and he created his own little world, and his paintings were much more, I think, important, more meaningful to himself, even though Xieyi was a great painter. I think Bada Shanren really took painting to create an internal world. And you can see some of the same elements, the use of motifs that are kind of funny and comical and simple in a way. But out of them, he creates these beautiful images of landscape. And I like this one in particular. This is from an album in the Metropolitan Museum because he signed it Bada Shanren Sketches or Writes. So this is an example of a kind of a sketching of ideas of a landscape painting. And I love this painting, which was in our exhibition that Susan mentioned of 10 years ago or so. Landscape painted at the studio of Singing Upon Awakening. This was his own studio, and it's probably from the final year of his life, 1705. And it's a very meaningful painting because he paints the studio directly under this line, his signature, which mentions in the last 3 characters the name of the studio, so we assume that this is the studio itself. But it's an image of reclusion. It's an image of hiding from the world. When in fact, as peaceful and as beautiful as this image is and very simple, the reality was that his studio was in the city. You know, it was a little walk-up apartment building, you know, whatever they had back in the very beginnings of the 18th century. So there's so much that goes into Bada Shanren's paintings. The paintings appear simple in many ways. The images are engrossing. The use of the brush and ink is amazing. His talents with this kind of joy and skill that he employs with the brush, his mastery of the ink and the brush is just extraordinary. And it has all the qualities of calligraphy in that regard. And you read this frontispiece here, which unfortunately we can't quite see because the painting's so darn long that you have to unroll it even further. But he says, cold mists, light ink, just like seeing the person. And then you get to that final inscription in that complicated poem. I doubt anybody here has had the patience to try to read through it, but it's worth doing if you really want to understand the complexities of Bada Shanren. As explicated by Professor Li Huishu, it's an amazing poem filled with illusions, complicated illusions. They just bring you into this complicated world of an individual that has its pictorial component in this beautiful painting. I think that's it. Thank you very much. I have no idea how long I talked. Anyway, if anybody has questions, I'll happy to do my best. Yes.
I've always wondered if they made mistakes in their calligraphy and what they did. I always wondered if they made mistakes in their calligraphy and what they did about that.
That's a great question. Let me show you. He made a mistake right at the beginning of his poem. He was so drunk. He said, spring rain is blown by the spring wind, or something like that. Anyway, it's something he would never do. And that's one mistake, but he just let it be. So sometimes they did that. Sometimes when they recognized that they wrote a mistaken character, sometimes they would put little marks right by the side to say that it was a mistake. Sometimes they would actually add a little character at it, but that doesn't look very good. But they rarely start all over. They rarely say, oh, throw it away, as far as I know. Yes, sir.
I'm curious what those red stamps are that you see on all the paintings.
These are seals, what we call seals, ink impressions, They can belong to the artist. Sometimes more often they belong to collectors. So those help us follow the transmission of a piece. Sometimes we recognize who the collector is.
Hi, so I'm intrigued by the painting that you showed towards the beginning, the wintry bamboo. And you said that it was sort of the reverse because the leaves were
Left in reverse.
the bare paper, yeah. So as someone who does printmaking that involves stencils,
Yes.
I was just wondering if that wasn't perhaps an explanation of how he achieved that, because the background is so uniform, it would be really hard to do it otherwise.
Maybe stencils or maybe some kind of wax. That was some kind of solution that was applied so that the ink wouldn't get soaked into the silk at that particular place. But your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah.
So I gather that they were fairly prolific artists, and where did they keep their work? Where did they sell their work? Who collected it? And do we have large collections around, or just these wonderful things that are in museums?
That's an excellent question. There are many answers to that. I know some painters, and they tend to be working all the time. Not everybody, I guess, is industrious, but the ones that I know are, incredibly industrious. They tend to have patrons, people that buy their work. Sometimes they'll do it, modern days they'll do it through galleries. Well, in pre-modern times they would do it through, they would sometimes bring their work to mounting shops, and they would be hung there, and then somebody would see it, and they'd want to buy it. The better-known artists would be working on commission, be working for a patron, a specific patron. Sometimes they were brought in as guests and live, in some wealthy person's home for a period of time and do a number of paintings and then reap the reward, leave the paintings there. As for the transmission of the work, there have been collections from, we hear of collections already in the 3rd or 4th century AD. So, it's been going on a long time, private collections. And in fact, one of the great stories of painting and the vicissitudes of regards the vicissitudes of collecting. You collect things and then the thing is lost. A boat overturns, all these things fall in the water, or get burned, or you lose your life or whatever, or you have an ungrateful child. There are stories of one of the most famous paintings in the National Palace Museum dwelling in the Fuchuan Mountains. That painting was so beloved by an owner in the 17th century that he insisted it be burned on the funeral pyre so that he can enjoy it up in heaven. And fortunately, he had a nephew that knew how much the painting was worth and pulled it off of the fire, so that we only lost a little piece of it. It's now separated. The very beginning of the paintings in the Zhejiang Provincial Museum, and the rest of the long scroll is in the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. There are all kinds of stories about these kinds of things. So, and today there are many private collectors, some that have wonderful things, and of course things tend to gravitate into major public collections. So, they're a wide range.
That was a wonderful talk, thank you. I have 2 questions that are related. If we're looking at photographs of these, the earliest calligraphy in China, what was the ink? Was it animal, mineral, like vegetative? It's remarkable that we still have remnants of that. Mm-hmm. And my second question is, China's a very humid country. And do you have any guess of these ancient scrolls? How did they survive? And is there a lot of evidence of restoration on the more famous ones through the years?
Yes. So about preservation and also about the materiality of the paintings. The ink is amazing stuff. It's the Chinese ink. It's made from pine soot mixed with a little bit of animal glue and water.
What is that first word?
Pine soot.
I don't know what that is.
The burning, pine would be
Pine.
soot. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's one of the amazing things about ink is that while it's wet, you can dilute it. But once it's dried on the paper or silk, unlike watercolors, you can apply water over it and it won't affect it. Which is one of the reasons why Chinese painting can be so subtle, is because they kept overlaying, putting layers upon layers of ink on it. The pigments, on the other hand, are from animal and vegetable, or not animal, but either mineral and vegetable origins. So those are a little bit different. Chinese believed originally that silk was more durable than paper. That proved to be wrong. So a well piece of paper preserved from the 4th century is possible. Silk, is organic, so it tends to deteriorate. And you're right, humidity is a natural enemy of anything material. But the Chinese were, they were very keen to preserve these things, and they developed their own techniques for, they could be very rudimentary, like simply bringing them out and during the dry season and sunning them to make sure there's no mildew or nothing growing. They had problems with insects. They discovered you can use certain kinds of sandalwood, for example, would keep the insects out. But yeah, that's a complicated question. I don't know how they preserve these things either. What?
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
There is such a thing as remounting the painting.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, yeah, and these things were almost always remounted, numerous times. Ideally, you would not want to remount a painting or a scroll because there's an old saying, every time you remount a painting, you harm the painting. Because remounting it means you've got to soak it in water to remove it from its backing, the glue that keeps it to the paper. But of course, if sometimes they get damaged, if a painting or calligraphy is not well mounted to begin with, it'll crack over time, and you want to get that fixed. So yeah, it's complicated. Mounting is another art form into itself.
So that makes these pieces, they are just that much more precious, it's true. Because there are people who recognize the values, I'm talking about artistic values, and collectors will preserve them, So what we're seeing is really a fraction of what we're done back then. Any other questions? These are great questions. Well, thank you, Peter.
Thank you.